Welcome to our second presentation for LSK3701 Science and Technology Teaching in the Foundation Phase. Today we will present on Learning Unit 1. I am your lecturer, Mrs. A. Carrim, and you can contact me on ecareer1@unisa.ac.za for any further support. Okay, so Learning Unit 1 is basically the nature of science and science learning. After you completed this learning unit, you should be able to analyze problem-based scenarios in the environment and society to demonstrate the development of scientific literacy. You also need to be able to communicate ideas and opinions about the nature of science and scientific literacy by means of appropriate academic and professional discourse, and identify and interpret scientific concepts in science investigations. Remember, when you're teaching science, you always need to incorporate investigations so that students can learn for themselves through practical teaching methods. They need to be able to, you need to basically cite appropriate examples to demonstrate the understanding of scientific concepts, whether you as a teacher display examples, and then the students retaliate by giving examples as well. And also to identify, interpret, and analyze children's thinking processes in relation to science. Okay, so before we start, what is the purpose of this learning unit? It's basically to develop your understanding of the nature of science and science learning. The notion of understanding science is developed through inquiry, and inquiry-based learning is proposed as the learning approach that must be followed to enable learners in the foundation phase, especially to develop scientific literacy and an understanding of the nature of science. So in order to learn science, remember, learners must learn scientific concepts and science process skills to develop their positive attitude towards science. So what are scientific concepts and how are they learned? This is a question that needs to be answered by introducing to you this theory of conceptual change as it pertains to the learning of science. So this theory provides an explanation of how scientific ideas or concepts are represented in the human brain. So language actually plays a very important role in the development of this kind of representation. So this is an important chapter. So let's firstly understand scientific literacy. What is National Science Learning Area curriculum of South Africa aimed at? Remember, it's aimed at promoting learners' scientific literacy. So that is very important to understand. Who is it aimed at? What is it promoting? What are the four interrelated features referred to by scientific literacy? So remember, when you going through your learning unit 1, you will see there are four interrelated features that they talk about: scientific knowledge and the use of that knowledge, to identify questions, that acquire new knowledge, to explain the scientific phenomena, to draw evidence based on conclusions about the science-related issues, and also understanding the characteristic features of science as a form of human knowledge and inquiry. And it's also important that you develop awareness of how science and technology shape people's material, intellectual, and cultural environments, and also their willingness to basically engage in science-related issues with the ideas, of science as constructive, concerned, and reflective, as a concerned, reflective citizen. So what does scientific literacy influence? What do you think scientific literacy influences? It influences people's decisions about personal societal problems. If, for example, you had to decide whether a nuclear power station for that should be built in your province, what would you say about it? And what would you base your argument on? How would you react if a landfill was built near your home? The overall aim of science curriculum is to develop learners' scientific literacy. This aim may be broken down into components that are so achievable, within the curriculum and program that is planned in order to promote basically scientific literacy. There are basically three components that are distinguished to promote the aim of scientific literacy. So you need to understand that it's scientific knowledge or concepts, the scientific process skills, and scientific attitudes. And why is this aim broken down into components? Why do you think it's broken down into components? Basically, you need it to be broken down into components so it can be achievable, within the curriculum and program, as I mentioned earlier. It's not easy to just rush all the information to foundation phase learners. You need to do it in stages so that they can understand it better. Okay, so let's now go to the nature of science. Let's understand this. Um, what are the two main views that people hold about the nature of science? I think this is also something that Learning Unit 1, incorporates. There are two main views. So basically, the more traditional view, this is held by teachers, is that science is a subject that has rules, that has laws and theories that need to be learned. But the more modern view is that science is a study of thinking and, of like basically a natural phenomena. So it's basically a way of trying to understand the world and um, of thinking and acting. So only if you view science as a way of doing rather than an object to study will you be motivated to teach science, as a form of inquiry and not just a subject. So this is how you should view science, um, as I said, this will give you more motivation to teach the subject, and you'll bring to the classroom a more creative side to you as a teacher. So, how do learners become scientifically literate? How do you think they become scientifically literate? It is through learners' inquiry that they actually develop their understanding of the nature of science and actually become scientifically literate. So, as a teacher, you need to think about this, reflect. How can you use teaching approaches to develop the scientific literacy of children who are curious about the world? Remember, you could, for example, like I said, teach science through inquiry. There are other ways to teach, science in an integrated way. This is where we talk about STEAM. STEAM is basically stands for science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So, how can you incorporate the STEAM approach to teach science in an integrated way? So, teaching science, basically means taking into account this vast variety of of science, of technology, of engineering, arts, mathematics, and incorporating it into your teaching through perhaps play, so that it can encourage students to enjoy the lesson also. So there are other ways of teaching, and that's what you need to also understand. It's basically teaching science by means of indigenous knowledge, or teaching science to play, like I said. So in the study guide, you can it mainly focuses on teaching science to inquiry. So what is the nature of the practice of science? So scientific knowledge is tentative, it's subject to change. Basically, it's derived from the observations of the natural world, and partly like through imagination, to creativity, socially, culturally, all of that can be incorporated into your science lessons. And also, there's always a distinction between observations and inferences, whether when you look at the relationship between the scientific theories and laws. So, always have a good understanding of your subject content. What are other ways that you encourage the practice of science? There are various, methods of investigation that you can use. You can use current knowledge guides, which can guide your investigations. You can, allow students to create assumptions. This is how they involve in formulating and conducting scientific inquiries. There are also limitations to data collection and analyzing and address. You can gather research questions that they can answer before going into the science lesson. And also alternative explanations are always a good way to develop an understanding of the content. There's also various reasons behind the use of controls and variables. You learn that more towards the within this learning units that we are coming to. And there are differences between data and evidence, and we need students to be able to connect evidence and explanations, and Communicate is very important. They need to communicate, and this plays a role in the development and acceptance of scientific information. And another thing is what integration promotes the development of scientific literacy. Remember the integration of explicit reflective instruction, all of that, it basically um, provides scientific inquiry in science topics, and it promotes the development basically of scientific literacy. So this is a very important concept that you need to understand. We will now go to learning science through inquiry. We spoke about this a few times when I started this presentation. It's very, very important that you understand and be able to, give an example of a lesson that you can do through inquiry. So, too many teachers approach science as if it is a body of knowledge, that anyone can simply memorize. However, there is a wealth of scientific knowledge, and more is being generated every moment, and we don't know which facts will be the most important in learners' lives. So remember, we wanted to make a difference. We wanted to make sense in their own world. So what do we know? What we do know is that everyone will be faced with new problems, as life is, and we attempt to solve these problems. So those people basically uh, we need to develop students that are able to solve problems, most successfully, and we need to develop attitudes and thinking in science that are the same as those attitudes and thinking that are that enable people to solve everyday problems that you go through. Okay, so do you think science can be memorized? Like I just said, I think it's something that needs to be understood. It's not something that can be just memorized. And that's the reason why you need to consider investigations and, bring science to life into your classroom. What makes the exploration of science enjoyable and supports the lifelong learning of science? Remember, like we said, it's solving problems, solving everyday problems, and making science enjoyable, and making students understand the value of science in their lives. So what does the inquiry-based approach develop? So remember, we want to basically develop thinking and reasoning that is open-minded, that makes exploration of science enjoyable. So the inquiry-based approach develops scientific thinking. So it serves different functions. Basically, it promotes the development of scientific concepts. It develops understanding of how we know science. It develops an understanding of the nature of science, and also it brings skills of independent inquiry about the natural world. So, what do you understand by inquiry as a teaching approach? Remember, it is very important as a teacher to understand this. It is basically opposite to, it's opposite to the pository approaches like the transmission approach, which exposes information, where you just give information out, but you don't allow them to actually, be part of the learning process. Is constructivist in nature. So learning is a result of ongoing changes in our mental framework. We attempt to make meaning of our experiences. We need our learners to make meaning of what they're experiencing in science. So we encourage active learning in children, develop that attitude of curiosity. Curiosity is something to look at something from a new perspective, and to we want our students to question what is being observed. That's how you bring inquiry into the classroom. um, so why is it important to encourage learners to ask questions? Why do you think that learners need to be encouraged to question, to wonder, to ask why, and to be cautious about accepting things at face value? The inquiry approach is based on asking questions, basically, and observation and learners' own explanations. It encourages learners to explore new situations in an objective and an open-minded way. So it is very important that you understand that in learning unit 2, you'll go further to understand this. You'll find explanation of science process skills, which is developed through inquiry. And this also will allow you to think and work like scientists. If learners use these process skills, they will develop the view of science, not as a body of knowledge, but as a process of learning about the world. And through learning about the world, learners will start developing an understanding of the world through their understanding of scientific concepts. So in the next section, You should start developing an understanding of the difference between a scenario where children learn science as facts and a scenario where children learn science by developing and understanding concepts. So this is where we're looking at scientific concepts. So before we can discuss how scientific concepts develop in foundation phase learners, we should know what a concept is. So concepts are basically representations in the brain. To be precise, a concept is something that is constructed in our brains. You can refer back to the module on learning theories and review the constructivist theory in particular, I think in previous modules that you may have done. So why is it important to develop scientific concepts in the foundation phase? Remember, if you are still very uncertain, about concepts, the idea of how activity in the brain can lead to learning is very complex. So for now, it is important that you know how connections are made. Made in the brain. That can lead to learning. So in this section, we're basically hoping to improve your understanding of how thinking and talking about scientific concepts lead to people learning and understanding these concepts. So concepts are basically basic units of knowledge and allow people to organize and categorize information. So the ability to organize and categorize information plays an important role in the process by which scientific concepts are developed in the brain. So there are various ideas about what concepts are exactly, and the different authors, they describe them differently. Um, but it's important for you to go through Learning Unit 1 so that you understand why it is important to develop scientific concepts in the foundation phase. Let's look at the three components of a concept described by Lito. This is also very important. There are different concepts that build different bodies of knowledge that may contain different kinds of representation. So if you look at figure 1.1, this is also in your study guide on page 6. It's basically concept X, prototype X, examples of X, and a theory of X. Um, so if I give you an example, therefore, the basis of this explanation means that learners build up a representation in their brain. They form connections based on examples of a concept. So this is how they think and reason. Within this concept. And let's look at the concept of birds to illustrate how this works. So the concept of bird, the prototype is a chicken, and examples of birds would be pigeons and doves and hawks. And then we ask them to build a theory on this. How do birds look? So they can say the theory of birds is that birds have two legs, they have two wings, and they have feathers, and they can fly. So when children learn about birds and they compare them with reptiles by comparing and contrasting, they use their experience that there is an example of a bird or prototype of a bird, which could be, for example, a chicken, like I said. And they will know from a young age that there are birds such as pigeons, there's doves, there's hawks, and this is how they make sense. And through these examples in their minds, they build this theory of birds, and they begin to develop the theory of what birds are by comparing all of these examples. So children will then understand, the theory that we just said. So these connections of birds, for instance, are not made if learners are taught to memorize facts. If we're trying to make them memorize it, they might not even find these connections. And facts are remembered for a period of time, remember, and they cannot be used to solve problems. So our aim is so that they can use what they've learned, to solve problems in life. So one example of problem solving with respect to the topic of birds, for instance, is when children are given a worksheet, and asked to name animals on a worksheet, and they decide if they are birds or not. Children will use the concept of birds that we discussed now to solve this problem, classifying on a worksheet, and they may rely on their knowledge of the examples of birds. So, however, what they really should do is organize the animals into groups according to the theory of birds. So therefore, we should ask questions such as, is it an animal that has two legs, two wings, feathers, claws, a beak? Can it fly? This is how they will understand better. Okay, so when looking at this, I trust that you do understand. Now, let's look at what must teachers do to develop scientific concepts. So remember, they need to know how children understand the concepts that are taught. Teachers need to ask questions, like I said previously, and allow children to explain their understanding at the beginning. This is often described as pre-knowledge, I'm sure you know in the classroom, but later you will learn that it is better to call children's understanding naive theory or preconception. Because remember, we're trying to get them to understand it in a better, broader light. So ask good questions that lead to observation, that lead to comparison, classification, and making of predictions and inferences. So we're going to allow children to explain. By explaining, children use the new words that they've been taught, what they have learned, and they develop the theory of scientific concept. For example, the theory of birds, like we just spoke about. So allow children to communicate the understanding of scientific concepts through different forms of communication, such as poetry, art, role play, to just that's just to name a few. Um, yes, so I hope that you do understand, basically a basic understanding of what I mean by this three components of a concept described by Lito and how it's important, to help learners develop their own understanding of a concept. Now we go on to how concepts basically develop. So for when do children develop their own understanding of the world? Remember, it's from birth we develop a certain understanding of the world around us and how the world works. Um, this is how our scientific understanding of the world starts. Why is young learners' ideas of the world described as naive? Why do you think it's described as naive? Because young learners have ideas, about how the world works from seeing what happens when they interact with the world and with people around them. Their understanding is called naive because it is not always very scientific or sometimes true. Sometimes, when we listen to our young kids or our young siblings, it's kind of comical to listen to what their idea of the world is because they just learning, they just exploring and observing. So learners bring this understanding of the world to the classroom. So this is why it is important for teachers to consider learners' understanding of the world and the scientific concepts before they teach, because they bring this understanding, and teachers will want to develop a more scientific understanding of the concepts. It is more important that teachers know what learners' understanding of scientific concept is before they actually teach it. So, what example can you describe of how children have a naive concept about a scientific phenomena? So one example of how children have naive concepts about scientific phenomena is the water cycle. Remember, using clouds as an example, young learners may think that clouds are like cotton wool. I think I was one of those young children. It's because of how it looks. It's difficult for young learners to understand that clouds are actually made up of tiny water droplets. If you need to teach the water cycle in particular, looking at the rain, which water comes from clouds, you must know what learners understand about clouds and how they have come to that understanding. On the basis of your understanding of young learners understanding about clouds, this is how you will plan and present your inquiry based learning activity. So you need to consider the example above about how you will plan and present an inquiry based learning activity to develop the scientific understanding of that specific scientific phenomena. So how does scientific development occur? Scientific development occurs through changing learners' naive understanding to a more scientific understanding. And that's where you look at the Lito diagram that we just went through. And remember, conceptual change is your naive understanding plus your scientific understanding. Now we're looking at conceptual change in the learning of science. So what is scary is 2009's description of the process of conceptual change. It's always important that we understand several ideas about how conceptual change happens in the brain. So according to her, Carey says that conceptual change happens through many bootstrapping activities. So what do you understand by bootstrapping? Bootstrapping is, you should have an understanding of the world. The word booting basically was used some years back to refer to the process of starting a computer. In a computer talk, a bootstrap is a program that allows sequence of programs to load and to initiate the operating system of the computer. In other words, a bootstrap is a small amount of information, that a computer needs to load bigger programs, such as word processing, coding, information, whatever it may be. It needs, in order for it to run, So the computer cannot load big programs from the beginning. It needs to start with small amounts of coding. This is how our learners take in information. Um, so think back on a video about links that are made in the brain when the learning takes place. I'm sure you've done this in other learning modules. Learning does not take place from the beginning with all information that is received. So think of an example of conceptual change. How would you change a naive understanding of scientific concept to a scientific understanding of, a scientific concept? Remember, learners cannot learn all facts at once. They need to start with small amounts of information that get linked together in scientific concepts. So this is very important that you understand. There is also an explanation for the term bootstrapping, which refers to the imagined feat of lifting oneself off the ground, by pulling one's bootstraps. So imagine how you would lift your feet by pulling on your shoelaces. Or imagine you cannot lift your feet by yourself. You have to pull on bootlaces to get to the next step. So it is hard work and almost impossible. This saying is supposed to demonstrate that getting out of a difficult situation by one's own efforts is hard work. So using the word bootstrapping to refer to conceptual change tells us that learners learn bits of information slowly through hard work. So I think so. What are the characteristics of bootstrapping? We need to understand, as a model of conceptual change. Remember, you need to understand that the components, they need to be related somehow and learn directly in terms of each other. So, for example, to understand the scientific meaning of a concept cloud, you must understand water, water vapor, water liquid, temperature, pressure. So this is where you're going to start looking for all the words that work within your lesson and components of the concept. The components of a concept are, in terms of, for example, it's not possible for young learners to understand liquid water can evaporate and form water vapor and condense to liquid water when the temperature and pressure are perfect for the formation of clouds. So you're going to basically start with the words and then go into the more complicated information. So learners are introduced, with words, and they use them with their explanations and their communications. Even though they are not scientifically understood, these words are known as placeholders because they basically hold the place of the while they developing the scientific understanding of a concept. So I want you to read more about this on page 12 in your study guide. And then you need to also know what are the modeling processes for. So remember, they are used to form a foundation for developing a clearer scientific understanding of these placeholder words. And this can also be understood further in your study guide. Um, and then we look at what do you understand by placeholders? We have discussed it earlier. They basically the words that learners are using, because they're still developing their scientific understanding. And then what is your understanding of this modeling processes in with reference to analogy and inductive inference? So remember, the inquiry-based learning approach that we spoke about become examples of this for a scientific concept, with particular reference to how a more scientific understanding can be developed by an activity such as a cloud in a bottle, all of that. I think there will be links to videos such as that you can make more sense of this. So what do you need to know as a foundation phase teacher in order to develop activities that will start the long and slow processes of conceptual development? This is very important for you to understand. Remember, you need to understand what learners' understanding of scientific ideas are in the beginning of science. What scientific concept do you want to teach? What is the new scientific knowledge or understanding in respect of that concept? Think of the placeholders that you can use. How are you going to develop the new scientific understanding of the concept from learners' naive understanding? How are you going to use this bootstrapping technique? How are you going to plan the science activities? What modeling activities, analogies, or examples you're going to use in that specific inquiry-based lesson? So these are all questions that you need to ask yourself. Remember, we hope that you have seen the importance of learning of science in terms of language. You have just seen notice that without learning the vocabulary of science or words that explain scientific concepts, in terms of placeholder words, children cannot develop that understanding of scientific concepts. So this is where you see how you can integrate language into your lesson. So now we understand that language is important in science. So let's look at language and the learning of science in a bit more detail. So why does language play an important role in the learning of scientific concepts? Remember, language plays an important role in terms of hands-on activities. You need to develop language and reading. Reading is very important in science. So a learner who cannot discriminate or, between the letters or read words, they cannot comprehend what is being said in the understanding of science. So remember, reading about the world when one doesn't have experience of the world is a problem for comprehension. So hands-on activities through inquiry-based learning aids learners language development and the understanding of science. So you need to be able to suggest types of language activities that can be incorporated into teaching science. Think about it. As a teacher, you can find several science activities about wind on the internet, for instance. So if you do these inquiry-based, sorry, I think I have to start one more time.
No problem, you can restart.
Okay. Okay, so we can start now. When it comes to language and the learning of science, we now have a basic understanding of how important language is in the learning of science. It plays a very important role, and that's what you need to understand in terms of a student basically reading something in the science booklet or a case study. They would need to comprehend what is being read. So let's remember that hands-on activities done in inquiry-based learning aids requires language development and understanding of science. If, for example, learners read a story about the wind but have no experience of the wind, then the story may not make sense to them. So as a teacher, we need to suggest types of language activities that can be incorporated into our teaching of science. So as a teacher, I would consider reading a book, reading a book about the story of wind and also incorporating good questioning that will be able to make learners curious and think about scientific words and what they mean and use them in sentences to form a better understanding. So a scientific inquiry, it basically allows students to think about words, give them a chance to explain their observations and make inferences about what they observe. So learning about scientific concepts happens through, learning about scientific concepts happens through language. So the words that I use in explanations may not be well understood scientifically because of, the connections between different scientific concepts, and they've not been made yet. So we need to get the students to understand the words and use them in explanations and, in more language activities that basically develops not only scientific understanding, but also develops the language skills that can be incorporated into all subject areas. So what are the benefits of a good questioning technique? Like we've spoken before, in terms of inquiry, once we start questioning our students, we get them to be able to communicate more, to be able to present their ideas more, and this all develops their language skills and at the same time develops their scientific skills. So look at language activities for science learning that are guided by teacher questioning. So in terms of improved comprehension, this is what was found, particularly when we look at novel words such as those that are found in the learning of science. They basically improve the ability to question and explain what is observed in the scientific inquiries, and it actually improves the when we ask them to predict something, so it improves their predictions, which supports the scientific experimentation that we're trying to do. So what are the three language scenarios that are faced in a South African Foundation phase classroom? Remember, when we look at all the different scenarios that happen in a classroom, no, not one one school is the same. Everyone has challenges. There are some students that are really struggling with reading, and it actually affects the learning of science. So these are all of the things that need to be considered, especially although we will not give solutions to these challenges, it is important that we understand the implications of language, within our science lessons that will actually affect them. And how do we overcome these challenges and let it not affect our science lessons? We need to think about different methods, maybe using pictures, maybe using videos, so that we can still develop that scientific words and understanding, even though there is a barrier, whether it be in reading or writing or whatever that may be. So what is your understanding of the implications of language that is used, within the scientific concepts that are taught in a multilingual society? So, like I said, the first scenario is where learners are taught in their home language, which is English. And the second scenario is where learners are taught scientific words in English, but English is not their first language. And then you get a third scenario where learners are taught science in their home language, which is not English in the foundation phase, and taught science in English from the intermediate phase. So these are all the scenarios that are affecting the South African classrooms, and we need to think of diverse ways that we can help our students without not basically leaving our students out. So what is the role of working memory? Now we're looking at the role of working memory in the learning of science. So, what does this area of the brain control? All of that. So thinking or reasoning is controlled in the brain by an area that has an executor function. This area in the brain controls three main aspects of thinking. When it comes to recalling of information from long-term memory into working memory, and the inhibition or stopping of ideas that are not suitable for the thinking of the moment, shifting of ideas. So this is something that you need to go over on page 19 of your study guide, where you understand these three main aspects of thinking, and also understand the process of executive functioning in science learning. Remember, if you look at the diagram, you'll see if proper evidence is not given to change a learner's mind, then conceptual change will basically not happen. So you need to look at the naive knowledge that children hold, and these naive ideas are actually stopping the students, where with the chemicals in their brain, um, uh, to get relevant knowledge that need to be recalled in the working memory. So we need to understand that conceptual change happens when learners reason and they explain their thinking using the ideas in their working memory. So inquiry-based learning gives evidence for scientific ideas and understanding, and that's when they start shifting between ideas to reasoning, and that's when they will gain their new scientific understanding. So figure 1.6 in your study guide will show the importance of this process, in particular working memory in conceptual change of learners, and how limitations in working memory capacity impair learners' ability to extract information and to learn the skills that lay the foundation for later effective functioning, whether it be in mathematics, science, language studies, and interpersonal interactions. So this evidence links performance in working memory tasks to, when we talk of language vocabulary acquisition, early academic success in reading, mathematics, and comprehension. So the nature of science requires that learners start a scientific inquiry from an understanding of concepts. So young learners already have that understanding of concepts based on their interaction with the world and the people around them, which is stored in their long-term memory. So their understanding is based on the way in which concepts are connected in the brain. So whether it be the connected scientific concepts in the brain, they usually call it theory, and learning involves searching for these possible theories, for questions raised by basically learners, through curiosity and naturally asking questions. So we need to try and answer a question. A learner will start with, the theory of a concept represented in his or her brain. And this is where we need to give our students the time that they need to, basically understand and develop the scientific concept. So inquiry-based learning also lends itself to exploration, which results in causal reasoning, and the development of accurate, more intuitive theories. And this is how they make sure they understand how their naive ideas change, to a more scientific theory. So these connections are very important, and they made up of this small processes. So please, it's very important that we give the children, our learners, the time to process these science concepts. So you need to understand, like I said earlier, why the teacher of science require learners to start a scientific inquiry from an understanding of concepts, and then also what is connected, how the scientific concepts are connected in the brain, what is it called, what does learning actually involve, and what is your understanding of why learners ask questions, and you have to describe this whole causal reasoning and how it helps students update his or her theory about a concept. So remember the example that you can see on page 20 about heat insulation is it's very good activities on how children develop these understanding of complicated scientific investigations, and how it becomes so understandable, while they are practically doing it and through inquiry. So what type of learning lends itself to exploration? You need to understand the type of learning that can allow them to explore. So work on your lessons. Think of examples that can help you, allow learners the time to explore and not just hit a lot of facts at once. So what does this type of learning result in? You need to think what type of why is it, what do we want as a result from this? Do we want them to understand things in a more understandable way? Do we want them to be able to work with case studies already at foundation phase, or whatever the case may be? We need to look at things that are obviously more appropriate for foundation phase learners. And then also we need to look at the connections between the components of a concept made. Again, the Leto 2014 diagram is very important. And then you also need to understand the executive function, the EF, the three mechanisms. Children will recall from their long-term memory into their working memory. And then after the activity, children will have to explain why what they understood from that, and also the previous misunderstanding is obviously still present in their thinking. And this is where we can make them make that connections in their brains and develop new connections that they can move between their previous understanding and their new understanding, until the new understanding has formed a strong connection. A new connection takes a long time to develop, but eventually we as teachers get to that point where we get our students to understand what we're trying to, explain, or what our lesson entails. So working through the section, I'm sure you have made a connection between teaching language and teaching science. So remember, language plays a very important role, like we said, in learning in the foundation phase. And how is your thinking about teaching of science change? Have you made a connection between, teaching language and teaching science? How would you describe that connection? Start reflecting on, can language can you describe the connection between learning of science and learning scientific words in your lesson? So all of these things are things that you need to start focusing on language skills that you can incorporate, and then also how you can make learners understand the meaning of words and scientific concepts. It's sometimes very difficult to develop at foundation phase level, but with the necessary effort and the necessary skills, we can reach to that point. So like I said, when it comes to learning unit 1, it's very important that you, while you go through this learning unit, you develop an understanding, you reflect, you think of examples, you think of what you would do in the classroom. How would you incorporate a science lesson with with language or with mathematics, with art, whatever it may be, just to make the lesson more alive and more creative, and developing a lot of skills at once. Before I say conclude this learning unit, I just wanted to recap that in this learning unit, you were basically introduced to the theoretical underpinnings of our science education, for young learners in the foundation phase, and developing your understanding of what science is. You were also introduced to the idea of the nature of science, scientific literacy, and the teaching approach based on inquiry. Remember, I said that the inquiry approach is very, very important in the teaching of science. If children engage in reasoning and confront their naive ideas of the concepts in the course of inquiry based learning, conceptual change will take place. And since conceptual change in respect of learning of science involves, the shift from naive to scientific understanding of concepts, it's a long and slow process. You need to be patient, you need to understand this process, and it is recommended that this process start in the foundation phase or even at preschool level. Students are starting from grade RR. So the following unit will provide you with ideas to develop your science content knowledge for the purpose of teaching science to young learners. So now you will most probably be introduced to, the idea of big concepts, and big concepts, how are they used to, to organize science knowledge and focus on the planning of science activities that are presented to facilitate learning. And the science curriculum basically guides us as teachers, to choose science activities. So learners' science knowledge can be developed through a number of teaching approaches, which are also described, we will describe in the next unit. I thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope it helped you in some way to, to make sense of this learning unit and to start your activities and reflect and use examples and be able to apply this knowledge in the workplace. Thank you.